begin. The basic premise of us as the affirmative team is that federal courts are proven in just about every possible instance to be a better option than military commissions. And we believe that since the evidence and the facts lean in that direction very clearly, there are no compelling reasons to use military commissions, as is present in the current system. Because of that, as my partner established in cross-examination, the negative team needs to prove a compelling and concrete reason to use military commissions instead of federal courts. And we believe that because they have not yet proven a compelling reason, and we have proven, on the other hand, that federal courts provide many compelling advantages over military commissions, including due punishment and that in due time, we urge an affirmative decision. I'd like to first respond to the negative team's arguments they brought up in their last speech, and then present a few new arguments in my own. First, they talked about a goal, accountable of U.S. strategic interests. And what I think we can agree about both the idea of justice and strategic interests is that the interest at stake in this case is justice. We are working towards justice because in the current system, closure is not being brought to the victims and all of those associated with 9/11, because this system that's designed to take care of international terrorists has failed to convict 5 co-conspirators for over 17 years. This is blatantly unacceptable, and we believe it's a concrete U.S. interest to work toward this idea of justice. So the next point they brought up was the overall principle that commissions should remain an option. And my response is, again, negative must provide a concrete reason. And we will show throughout this speech and in future speeches why they have not. The next point they brought up was talked about the nature of the cases in each system. And they talked about the argument that essentially military commissions handle certain different cases than military commissions that federal courts do not. However, as we brought up in the first affirmative constructive, we talked about how federal courts are well equipped to handle all terrorism prosecutions, and that they have the resources at their disposal to handle all of those prosecutions. We also discussed the difference in both how military commissions only have 32 charges at their disposal, while federal courts have access to over 4,000 charges. And we brought up 2 examples showing how when 2 different terrorists were brought to each of these systems under the same charge, the results were completely different, precisely because the amount of charges available in each system were different. And that shows a concrete reason why the nature of the cases shows that federal courts are better in all of these cases. They also moved on to saying some distinct differences about federal courts and military commissions. And this is how they attempted to fulfill that burden of showing why military commissions should remain an option. So the first of these points was the national security dismissal ideas, the national security dismissal. And basically what they contended is that federal courts don't necessarily allow a dismissal of the case if there is some sort of national security concern about the terrorist being on U.S. soil. Now, intuitively this might make sense. You don't want to have terrorists on U.S. soil, but the facts say the exact otherwise. In fact, according to Human Rights First, they wrote on February 2018 that there have been no attacks in a federal court. Quote, none of the districts that have tried terrorism suspects have been attacked in response, and Guantanamo actually hinders counterterrorism efforts. In a speech to the American Counterterrorism Society, Attorney General Eric Holder said that not one of the judicial districts involved has suffered retaliatory attacks, end quote. So the negative team has provided no concrete examples or explanations for how this national security threat exists. So any problem with an exclusionary rule does not apply because there is no threat in the first place. The second difference they talked about was evidence differences, talking about how perhaps the standards are different in each system. My first response to this is no impact. They talked about how hearsay evidence may or may not be different, but however, they did not impact to an example of how that has actually caused a problem with federal courts or an advantage to military commissions, so they haven't really proved any point here. Secondly, hearsay evidence is barred in both systems. According to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, they have a graph talking about how both systems, military commissions and Article III federal courts, bar hearsay evidence unless exceptions are granted. So in both systems, it's technically barred, but exceptions can be granted. So anytime there'd be a harm in a federal court, it would take place in a military commission, and anytime there would be an advantage in a military commission, it would take place in a federal court as well. So there's no compelling difference between the two here. The third point of distinct differences was exclusionary rules, and talking about essentially how evidence can be excluded in federal courts so that the prosecution may not take place. My first response is that the only difference is Miranda warnings. Now, Miranda warnings are, as explained by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, essentially exclusion of statements obtained by torture or cruel or degrading treatment. Now, we're not making a contention that we need to be soft on terrorists and that federal courts are nicer, so we should use them. But rather, the only difference between the two is Miranda warnings. So that's the first part of the response. My second response is that there is a public safety exception to Miranda warnings in federal courts. According to Carl Benoit, lawyer at the FBI Academy, quote, Miranda need not be strictly followed in situations in which police officers ask questions reasonably prompted by a concern for the public safety, end quote. So in any terrorism prosecution that takes place in federal courts, if there is a public safety threat, they haven't provided any examples of that being the case, but if there is a public safety threat, that Miranda safety warning could be exempted, and then there would be no difference between federal courts and military commissions once again. So there are exceptions that can be granted in federal cases. So those are the three distinct differences that the negative team established in their first speech. We have shown through the responses thus far that all of these differences are actually not in fact true, and that there are exceptions in federal courts that again establish how, as my partner brought up in our 1AC, military commissions have become an objectively worse option than federal courts. And if we look at all three of the differences they provided, we can also have one group response to all three of these points, which is that there is no advantage to commissions, no advantage to commissions. David Glazer established in January of 2012 that, quote, claims that the commissions offer legitimate practical advantages over Article 3 trials are mistaken. These assertions are misleading, end quote. In fact, that's really the main problem about the current system. Much of the reason that the military commission system still exists is that there's this public opinion of military commissions that they're designed for a purpose. And so our contention is that the purpose of military commissions is far from the actual results of the commissions. And we need to look at the facts and the results to determine whether military commissions should be preserved. And we believe the facts say they should not. I'd like to bring up one additional advantage, in addition to that justification of due punishment in due time. There's one additional advantage to federal courts, and that is that of international cooperation. William Finnegan reported for the New Yorker on October 15th of 2017 that, quote, it is clear that the military commission system at Guantanamo has failed miserably. Many successful terrorism prosecutions in recent years have followed extraditions, or in other words, transfers to the United States that would not have occurred if Guantanamo and its military commissions had remained an option. Our main counterterrorism partners, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands, will not cooperate with extradition requests unless the suspect is to be tried in a federal court, end quote. So right now, there is an arbitrary decision made for whether a terrorist can be tried in a federal court or in a military commission. So sometimes international cooperation happens right now. But when we guarantee that federal courts are used in every situation, international cooperation is guaranteed. And that's another compelling advantage for using federal courts. So once again, since we have proven that federal courts have compelling advantages and achieve justice and punish terrorists the way they deserve to be punished, and military commissions do not, we urge an affirmative decision. Thank you so much.